You all heard a little bit about who I am, what I do. So I'm a pharmacoepidemiologist. I also am the local network lead for something called the UK Reproducibility Network here at LSHGM. Some of you might have heard of it. So it's a nationwide organisation in the UK that aims to improve the reproducibility of science and to promote open science practices more broadly. And it's really kind of my interest in open science and reproducibility that led me to start this project on code sharing. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is, first of all, give you a little bit of a background to code sharing, to open science, why this is an issue I think we should be thinking about more often. And then I'm going to briefly run through the results of a review that I did in my professional society, so I'm a pharmacoepidemiologist in the International Society for Pharmacoepidemiology, looking at kind of opinions to code sharing, how frequent it is and that kind of thing. And then by the end, I'm hoping we'll be able to do some sort of polling about what you guys think about code sharing, and also just have a little bit of a chat about what we think about this, how we can get better at code sharing, if it's something we think is valuable. And yeah, really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it. So by means of a background introduction, so why take a whole hour out of your day to think about code sharing? So I think it's fair to say that over the past decade or so, there's been a renewed focus on transparency, reproducibility, and replicability in science in general. And, you know, part of that, I think, comes from a very basic instinct. If you stopped someone in the general public on the street and you asked them, do you think it's reasonable that a year after completing a study, if you ran exactly the same code on the same data, you'd get the same result? I think most people would think that, yes, actually, that's kind of the minimum bar for what we'd expect scientists to be able to do. If they sit down at a later point and try and reproduce their own results, we want there to be quality assurance processes in place that kind of ensures that we can do that. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that's always the case. And, that's not to say that other people do things badly. I've certainly had the experience of coming back to a project after a few years and going, oh, God, what was the order I ran this in? And I think even more concerning is the fact that not only can we not reproduce sometimes our own studies, but if we try and replicate these studies using a slightly different database, but using exactly the same methods, it's not always the case that we get consistent findings there either. So the attention on this kind of issue of replication and reproducibility really came from this large reproducibility effort in psychology. So this is a study done by the Open Science Collaboration, led by Brian Nosek. And essentially what they were interested in was taking large psychology studies, or psychologists in studies, and thinking, well, if we try and do these studies again, do we get the same results? And you'd hope, for most studies, if you try and repeat it using exactly the same methods, you'd get roughly the same results. So they did this for 100 studies published across 3 different psychology journals in 2008. And there's no kind of agreed metric of what it means to replicate or reproduce a scientific result. But what you can see here in the panel is the p-values. So you can see in the original studies, actually 97 out of 100 studies had p-values less than 0.05. But in the replications, you can see this huge spread of p-values, and significantly, well, using that term loosely, fewer studies found a low p-value. And again, looking at effect sizes, so this is standardized effect sizes across standardized effect sizes across the different studies. You can see that in the original studies, effect sizes tended to be larger. And this kind of headline finding that they sort of publish, and you might have seen this as well before, is that over half of studies did not reproduce according to their pre-specified replication criteria. So that's a pretty poor result, I think, for psychology. And what I think is really interesting about this study is that in an accompanying prediction market study, which is essentially a study where you try and bet on the outcome of a certain replication, they essentially asked psychologists which studies they thought would replicate and which they thought would not. And what was interesting here is that psychologists really only expected that around 50% of the studies would be able to replicate. And they were also able to identify those that were most likely to replicate. And the authors, I think, summarized this pretty neatly here with this quote. So the relatively low rate of reproducibility should not come as a surprise to the profession of psychologists, because it is essentially consistent with the beliefs that they hold. So they expected about half the studies would replicate and about half did. But that's a pretty poor showing, right? And I think most people would like to think that science is more robust than this. Okay, let me just go forward. So moving on to kind of epidemiology, we have the REPEAT initiative in pharmacoepidemiology, which published the results in 2022. So that looked at both the clarity of reporting for 250 database studies, and essentially assessed how well these studies reported their methods. And they found that only 3 out of 250 studies required them to make no assumptions about how they found different variables. So quite a lot of missing information in terms of methods reporting. They then assessed the independent reproducibility of 150 of those, and you can see the results kind of in this graph. So perfect reproducibility would mean kind of everything centered around 1. And you can see that's kind of where most studies fall, but with some tails to either end. And the conclusion from this team is that the majority of results could be relatively closely reproduced in pharmacoepidemiology, but a significant subset could not be. And the main reason they couldn't reproduce these findings was because of incomplete reporting and changes in the underlying data. So thinking about kind of potential solutions and how we can get to a better point here, from the original reproducibility studies in psychology, the open science movement really came out of those and was proposed as a solution. And open science just means that we essentially report methods completely transparently. Where feasible, we share the underlying data so others can reproduce our results. We make the code that we use to analyze the data public, and we publish the results so that they are accessible to others, essentially in an open access format. Oh yeah, so I was going to say, I get the impression that most of you guys work in epidemiology and health research, so probably you're in a similar kind of context to me, where we can't actually share the underlying data. There's privacy concerns, but most of the time we can share the programming code. And this is now increasingly becoming mandated across the health sciences. So if you are funded by Wellcome requires both that you make any data as well as code publicly available. International Journal of Epidemiology also requires software to be made available. And as some of you might have seen, this is quite a recent announcement by the BMJ to update their data sharing requirements to ensure that code is available as well. So why do we have this kind of increased focus on programming code sharing? So there's actually relatively little published looking specifically at benefits of code sharing in a kind of systematic way, but there's a lot of opinion pieces. So summarizing kind of the proposed benefits of code sharing. First of all, it can give you greater insight into how someone interpreted a certain protocol, statistical analysis plan. So seeing how someone codes BMI can kind of provide greater clarity than reading a word description of that, because that might not contain enough details. It might promote the increase of new methods. So if you're using a particularly clever way of programming something, or you're using a new regression method, making code available can make it easier for others to use that method as well. It can facilitate error detection or correction. So you might have accidentally introduced coding errors, and by allowing others to look at the code, those can be found and corrected. It can engender trust in the honesty of competence of researchers. So essentially, so I work on vaccine safety. If we make all of the underlying code available, others can see exactly what analyses we've run, and that can increase the trust that we're not trying to bury results. It can protect against fraud or fraudulent reporting of research. So, for example, thinking about the Surgisphere papers in or during COVID, we can't make data available, but it's really difficult to come up with the amount of code required to analyze that amount of data. So to a certain extent, requiring code to be made available might make it harder to publish fraudulently created data, fraudulently analyzed data. And it can also improve scientific workflows. So the ways in which we share code, and I'll come on to that in a second, integrates quite neatly with using version control tools like Git or GitHub that can kind of have knock-on benefits in how we work. But it's not all benefits. There's a number of kind of potential challenges, or I guess barriers, that people have raised or thought about when it comes to code sharing. So first of all, most of you probably work full-time in academia, but if you work in industry, you don't necessarily own the code that you produce. So that might be owned by a company that has intellectual property rights over that and have a commercial interest in keeping that code private. There's a time and a resource burden. So if you aren't familiar with code sharing, if that's not part of your workflow, it can increase the amount of time required to complete an analysis or project. There might be a knowledge barrier, so you might want to share code, or in theory have nothing against sharing code, but you might not really know where to start or how to go about it. Something that came up often in our conversations with pharmacoepidemiologists was this idea of futility, thinking, well, what's the point of sharing my code? If I write up my methods as detailed as possible, what possible benefit could it have to other people to look at the raw code? I think this is more common in academia, so also self-consciousness, so this kind of fear that your code is not good enough to share or not wanting to share it, other kind of concern that others might find errors. And finally, data privacy. So spoken about how we can't really share data. I think this is less of a concern with code, but sometimes there are aspects of the code that could potentially tie in with data privacy concerns. So that can be, for example, sharing files for information that you shouldn't share accidentally. So, for example, by committing patient data or by including comments in your code around a certain patient, so for example, excluding this patient because death date was blah or something like that. But in the US, if some of you work on US databases, there are also some data owners that essentially have copyrighted the structure of the data. So you're not allowed to share any code that reveals details or information about the underlying structure of the data source either. So I think it does still play into code sharing, albeit to a lesser extent. Should also mention that code sharing is not a silver bullet to kind of fix these issues around reproducibility. So this is an assessment of computational reproducibility. So essentially looking at, can we get at the same results if we have the underlying data and code available? So this team did this with code and data submitted to a database run by Harvard. And they found that only a quarter of the scripts submitted ran without error when they tried to do it again. Most of this was due to kind of basic, not really errors, but just computational reproducibility barriers. So for example, using relative file paths that are never going to run for anyone else, or missing packages. So they managed to improve to almost half. It's still not fantastic. And when we've had assessments of computational reproducibility in other scientific disciplines, we've also found relatively low rates of computational reproducibility. So not fantastic. So it's interesting to kind of note that this is low computational reproducibility rates despite people making all their code and all their data available, right? So definitely not sufficient to kind of ensure we have reproducibility. And I think this really highlights that how code is shared really matters as well, if the aim is to enable computational reproducibility. And obviously also emphasizes that it's still really important to have really clear and unambiguous reporting of our methods. So what do we know about code sharing already? There was this meta-analysis of code and data sharing published in the BMJ just last summer, where they essentially looked at articles across all medical specialists that had quantified code or data sharing. And the results you can see on the slides, well, it quantifies the prevalence of code sharing, and you can see a large number of zeros. They estimate the meta-analyzed prevalence of code sharing in medical specialties to be less than 0.5%. So that's not particularly common practice. But none of these studies actually focuses on code sharing in epidemiology. And they also weren't really able to dig into how code is shared, if code is shared at all. So what me and my colleague John Tesser wanted to do was to look at, well, actually, what is happening with programming code sharing in pharmacoepidemiology, which is the area that we work in. So we decided to do a literature review looking at papers published in a specific pharmacoepi journal, Pharmacoepidemiology and Drug Safety. And essentially what we wanted to do was just quantify how many people shared code, and if they shared code, how they did it. So for the purposes of doing this, we had this definition of code sharing, which is essentially sharing any code, either just some or all of it. And this covers essentially code shared in any way, shape, or form, as long as it was available to us without further contacting the authors. So not just code published on GitHub, for example. And we also considered code sharing even if you only shared like a little, what we call a code snippet. So for example, a code illustrating, for example, how you implemented a certain regression model, or how a certain variable or algorithm was implemented, rather than the entire analysis pipeline. So we were really, really liberal, I think, in what we considered code sharing. What we didn't consider code sharing was any statement to the effect of code is available on request. Sharing of code lists, so diagnostic codes, was kind of out of the remit of this. We only were really interested in programming code. And using open source packages. So for example, and this happened frequently, people would state something along the lines of, we analyze data using the survival package in R. That is not something that we'd consider code sharing. So what did we find? So after kind of screening articles, we extracted information on code sharing from almost 1,000 articles. Most of those articles were original articles, so essentially applied work, with a smaller amount of methodological studies, so for example, for presenting a new kind of method or algorithm or simulation-based research. Something we found interesting is that 28 or almost 30% of articles didn't actually report which programming language they used, which was quite surprising to us. But among those who reported it, most used SAS, and that's probably a consequence of pharmacoepi being quite an industry-heavy field. So SAS very common, and that was followed by R or Stata. So among these papers, we found that 62 mentioned or referenced programming code sharing in text. And when we tried to access the code, we could do that for 48 of those. So the overall prevalence of code sharing was just under 5%. Looking at how that changed over time, some indication that there's a bit of a jump in 2022. Although I should mention that the numbers for each year are relatively small. This we found quite interesting. So we found that most people actually shared their code in supplementary materials. So they would put code essentially in a Word document, make it into a PDF and upload it with the article. That wasn't always signposted in the methods. So this was quite a painful exercise, but we did actually look through the supplementary materials of all of these 1,000 articles. And occasionally, we'd scroll through a supplementary and just find code, even though that was mentioned at no point in the methods. This was followed by code published on GitHub and or sometimes made into a package that others could download. In terms of kind of code coverage, or like how much code people shared, we actually found it was quite common to share just these kind of code snippets illustrating how a certain part of the analysis was implemented. So that was just over a quarter of articles that shared code in that way. Most code was shared with some kind of comments or instructions, but again, a substantial minority had no comments or no instructions. We did look at whether people released synthetic data with the code. That was relatively rare, and licensing of the code. So that essentially means that you specify or clarify the conditions under which someone else can reuse it. That was rare as well. Okay, so this we then went on to look at, well, is code sharing more or less common according to other characteristics? And just to highlight a couple here, we found that code sharing was more common among papers that had a methodological focus and among simulation studies in particular. So to kind of summarize what we found here, so programming code sharing in pharmacoepi was rare, but our estimate is higher than the other estimates we have for medical research, which are currently at less than 0.5%. So we feel like this indicates that, there is some willingness to share code, but code is not always shared in a way that promotes uptake and reuse. And the fact that we found code in supplementaries so often, I think, is an indication of this. We also had a program of work which involved interviewing people working in different contexts about code sharing. And just to flag that for researchers working in industry, these particular barriers around IP rights and kind of the futility or asking yourself, well, what's the point of sharing code, I think came up really frequently. And then I think an important thing that came out for us of this work is that actually code sharing is quite complex to define. We started out thinking, well, we'll just look at code sharing. That will be interesting, quick, and not controversial. But actually, it turned out that there's a wide range of opinions about what constitutes code sharing, whether using open source packages is sufficient, whether you need to make all code available or only some, and what the benefits of it are. So I think it's definitely a much more complex area than I thought when I set out on this. Yeah, I think the sort of definitions around code sharing are still kind of developing.